Welcome to the Building Interest Podcast presented by Leader Bank. In Season 2 of our podcast, we've been exploring what it means to be a leader through conversations with leaders from within the bank, the communities we serve, and from across the banking and technology industries. Each conversation focuses on our guest's personal leadership journey in hopes to gain insights on what it means to be a good leader. In our last episode, we were joined by the co-founders of the Hult Undergraduate Investment Group, Alejandro Suarez Cordova and Sahil Deer, to discuss the founding of their organization, their personal leadership journeys, and the impact that immigration has had on their growth and success as leaders. Today, we are honored to have a guest with more than 35 years of leadership experience, Marty Sunde, as we look to talk through his journey in hopes he will let us in on some of the most impactful advice he's received and given over the years, and explain what makes or breaks a strong leader. Welcome, Marty.
Hey, thanks, Greg. I'm honestly honored to be here. I've enjoyed the podcast series and looking forward to our discussion today.
I'm excited to hear that you're a listener and not just a victim. So this is a good start. Listen, I haven't known you for quite as long as all the experience that I teased in the opener there. I've known you for about five and a half months now. And we worked together just exploring some of my own personal leadership challenges and the directions that I might be able to grow and develop and things. And so I came to really understand a bit about how you operate and how you were able to turn that lens back on me and really help me understand a little bit how things were going for me, my career, my development, all based on, of course, the experience that you brought to the table. And so I guess for today, I kind of want to start with, I rambled off that introduction, painting a picture of what my view is of what a leadership advisor does. But let me ask you to share, how would you summarize what it is that you do these days?
Thank you, Greg, and I appreciate I've appreciated actually getting to know you and the engagement that we had. I don't, first, I don't really consider myself a professional leadership advisor, but I sure enjoy continuing to use lots of years of experience and wisdom and trying to figure out how to listen closely to what challenges people feel like they have in developing themselves to be more effective in their roles, managing people, in their roles, trying to grow their businesses. And I try to use my experience and the listening to just pose questions to people that might stimulate an area that they could focus on to improve. Or I try to motivate people to anticipate what's coming and to make sure that they feel like they can look around corners just a little bit better. Because if they can anticipate maybe the alternatives that are available to them, or anticipate some obstacles they might encounter and have some time to think about them and prepare, then I feel like I've added some value to, the outcome that they're aiming for.
Did you want to be a fortune teller when you were a kid growing up, and then you figured out that peeking around the corner in corporate America was the best way for you to get there? Or how did you sort of come up with this? I love that statement that you want people to be able to look around corners, right? Because none of us know what the future holds.
Right.
And yet the idea of being a leader is somehow to guide people into that uncertain future and hopefully do a decent job of it. So was that something that you always wanted to do, or did you have totally different dreams as a child, what you wanted to be growing up?
Well, I had a variety of different things that I wanted to be, I think, as I was growing up, and I probably fall into that category of not knowing exactly where I wanted to go when I was growing up. I have a brother, for example, who I think knew at 4 years old that he wanted, if he could, to be a doctor. And he was very focused on that, and it worked out for him, and he is that and very happy. I actually, growing up, enjoyed, looking back on it now, I enjoyed a lot of different pursuits, but most of them had to do with group activity. And I enjoyed being a member of a team. I found myself um, more often than not, maybe ending up trying to be the kind of the team leader or the instigator, depending on whether we were, doing mischief as a little kid or trying to get something done. But and I found myself actually at a young age comfortable in front of people talking about what we were trying to accomplish or a variety of different things. And so it felt natural to me as I went through school to be engaged in, continue to be engaged in team related activities. In the early days when I joined IBM and went through training, I didn't really know anything about technology. I'm fortunate that I found IBM because technology at that time offered an amazing amount of innovation opportunity. It was changing the way business worked, and it still is today. And so I learned in joining IBM that that it was really a challenge to think about how technology could create innovation and what innovation was useful and what wasn't. And I think that really attracted me to thinking ahead or seeing around corners.
Well, just there in that little bit, you mentioned a lot of very interesting words, and I want to come back to some of them, like challenges. I want to get back to challenges a little bit. But you talked about being comfortable and being natural, which is something I think that you exude as well. You offer a certain comfort and a certain natural environment when speaking with you. And yet you mentioned something very counter to comfortable, which is an instigator, right? And you mentioned a little bit about trying to break out of that box a little bit and not be constrained. Now, you mentioned IBM. You've had a number of different roles with some of the biggest names in corporate America, not just IBM. Were you, I mean, you come in kind of at the entry level at some point with one of these places. You're obviously not yet the guy who is going to lead everyone else forward. And yet you used words like not constrain and comfort and so do you feel like that environment where you were in really nurtured your ability to become passionate about leadership and corporate structure, or was it almost in spite of it, like you felt like, oh, this is this sort of droning pigeonholed corporation, and I want to make it different?
That's a great question, and it could be my nature. That helped me answer the question that I viewed that environment as enabling and not as suffocating or constraining.
So the
Uh,
same environment might have been constraining to someone else, but you turned around
Absolutely.
and used it to your advantage because it spoke to kind of your vision of, here we go, looking around corners again.
Yeah. Well, first, I believe that I joined the company with the idea that I was going to play a role for them, but I was going to learn a lot in the process. And IBM, people today talk about millennials wanting to change their experiences every 18 months or so. What's funny is I joined a very big company a long time ago, and one of their messages was, "We're so big and we have such diversity in the kinds of roles we have available. If you work hard and if you're willing to learn and you do well at the role that you're currently performing, any option is available to you." And so in my mind, right away, I didn't feel constrained. I knew I had to learn what I was being asked to learn. I knew I had to perform well against what was expected of me. But I always felt like I could look around and see what other people were doing, and I was going to be free to aim for that as long as I understood more about how to prepare for it and how to earn, not be entitled, but earn the right to compete for that. So it was an interesting corporate culture that taught you a certain way to operate, which I respected. The values aren't very different than leader values, to be honest with you. Uh, I was very comfortable playing inside those boundaries, but they also said if you do well, there'll be plenty of opportunity for you to continue to be curious and stay stimulated forever and ever. And that was a pretty neat culture in those days.
Yeah, I mean, obviously not the instant gratification, and you sort of mentioned the millennial approach of wanting something fresh and new all the time. And maybe that's not just limited to that group. We shouldn't chastise them alone. Fortunately, I'm out of it a little bit myself as well. But we all like that instant gratification. But what I'm hearing is this idea that the gratification was there and you knew it was available. It just was a little bit more of a patient road to get there so that you could be a little bit more formative before you got to that gratification.
Well, and yes, exactly, but not as I'll requalify. The reason I use the millennial example is after after kind of the initial onboarding and kind of proof that you kind of fit in the culture and you could you could deliver consistent results. Some of the opportunities came every 18 months to 2 years.
Okay.
So it was literally for me, I forget now, but I feel like oh God, in 18 years I may have had 11 different experiences.
Gotcha. So it didn't feel like you were stagnant or stuck. You were
No,
still constantly evolving, and that provided some motivation as well.
right. And the culture was so collaborative that if you wanted to try to figure out if you were willing to learn, there was always a way to gain the value of somebody else's wisdom. There were other training courses available. Today, those resources are available in a much broader sense, right? And
Right.
the internet's made them available to everybody who has an appetite to want to continue to learn. And leaders' culture, I think, is collaborative in the same way. And that if somebody wants to reach out and say, "Can you explain to me how you approach this?" People are always willing to help somebody else and pay it forward a little bit.
Absolutely. And the fact that we have some of these values spelled out at the bank is actually new for us, but they're not new concepts, and they're proven and they work, and that's why, we have them in place. So let's talk about challenges. So let's challenges part one, we'll call it. Corporate America wasn't always as great as the picture that you just painted of your early years at IBM. And I'm wondering if you could share some insights that you learned. We saw all these things going right. This pushed me, this motivated me. I had this cycle of opportunity that we just talked about to develop myself. But what did you see in corporate America that was more challenging to someone who wanted to grow forward and gain these leadership skills?
Well, I always, honestly, I always, at one point, IBM had so much training available and kind of so much history that you could self-select how to fit into the system and grow. At some point, I wanted to actually find out if my ability to progress was a function of working well within the system or whether there was some of me in that. And
Good question to
so,
have.
yeah, and so I left, and and the very first choice I made, I went to work for a company um, following another IBM person, thinking that would be a safe bet. And I found out that company cultures are very different. And I walked into a company that was um, um, a much more ruthless environment, uh, a much more get results or you're out kind of situation, and in a general lack of trust in the culture starting at the top that was really foreign to me. And this I'll ultimately name names a little bit for you, Greg, but this was an experience that was really a shock to me because I really was more of an idealist and kind of presumed that I could make an environment any way I wanted it to.
You didn't know
And
how good you had it where you were.
right, and this was an environment where I also learned that I could have an influence and I could apply my own skills. But wow, um, you know, what a change! And it was one that I actually had to. I was there, and by that time I had a family and responsibilities, and I had to make the best of it. And so the learning there was, okay, how do I actually embrace what this is and try to adapt and try to be flexible in kind of what they expected, but also not compromise myself in terms of my own values. And so for that year, I I fit in. I did my best. I applied skills I'd learned in other places and found out they did work pretty well. But I also learned things that I would remember for future roles and companies that I never wanted to experience again. So in the same way, companies interview employees to find a good fit. I think I learned the hard way that it was very important for me to be very conscious of the kind of culture I was going into and to do some more research before I took the leap, to make sure that the company was going to be compatible for the kind of person I wanted to be. Throughout my career and maybe starting in college or a little after, I maybe at IBM, I was trained to be more self-aware of what I did well and what I needed to improve on. And so I was conscious of that. And at some point in time, I actually decided that I would come up with my own brand idea. I would think about a theme that I thought set the tone for kind of the way I wanted to be. And my little theme was blending imagination with results. So I'd met a
Exactly
lot,
those two components.
I'd met a lot of people in all these companies that were head in the clouds, always ideating and always expecting never to have to deliver the results because their ideas were so amazing. And then I met a lot of people who were just grinding it out day to day. And their idea of thinking ahead was maybe the end of the month. And so I guess I decided over time that there was a unique gap in the businesses I'd been involved in, for people who had the capacity and willingness to try to think more broadly and do the work to to think creatively and innovatively about other approaches, but to also respect the fact that you actually had to figure out how to apply them to a successful result, or they didn't have any credibility. And so to me, I got in my head the idea that if I could always pursue imagination and always stay focused on reverse engineering that into predictable results, that it would be, easier for me perhaps to have credibility in things I did, whether it was inside a big company moving up or with people that were working for me, wanting to trust that we were doing good things, or ultimately investors who wanted to make sure that somebody was representing their investment in a responsible way.
So, Marty, you mentioned kind of creating your own theme and brand, and I'd like for you to explain a little bit about that. I mean, are we talking about a physical brand here? Are we talking about just sort of your personal vision? And how do you actually go about creating a theme and a brand, and what does that mean going forward for the role that you're in?
Yeah, and again, it's in our conversation. Throughout our conversation, you're going to probably hear me make statements and ask me about them, and you'll realize almost every time it's a mindset that I created for myself. So a lot of this is about having a frame of mind. And I was in I think, a class or learning more about product management and how to position products for consumers. And I was daydreaming a little bit. I wonder if I can learn anything myself about what I want to be when I grow up. Because again, I don't know that I limited myself to too many choices. And so I started asking myself, gosh, if I am I in a position where, even if I don't exactly know the industry or the exact role I might aspire to, or I don't want to limit myself to that, but is there a general theme that represents me that would help me make priorities about what I learn, um, set a tone for the way I want to be viewed? And so I started giving it some thought, and I came up with this observation. Again, like you might observe when you're trying to do research to see if there's a new product idea, you see a gap in the marketplace. And my gap was, I saw a lot of people that were very creative and counted on somebody else figuring out how to make it work. And I saw a lot of people that were very comfortable just pounding out the results day after day. But when you ask them to think innovatively at all, they weren't that capable or willing. And so to me, it felt like there was a gap between the two. And I thought, how amazing if you could live with the visionaries, understand what they're trying to say, but then come back to those that just wanted to pound it out every day and communicate it in a way that was understandable to them. There was a gap. And I thought, gosh, I want to be that kind of person, because I think if I can learn how to lead and translate between these two mindsets, I'll enable better results for both. And so my brand actually represented the kind of leadership opportunities I went looking for. And it just helped me um, differentiate between choices I had. When I'm trying to help people think ahead, I don't want them to say, well, I want that job. Usually when I ask this question and they say, well, I'd like to have this job, I usually ask them to describe the characteristics of the job that are exciting to them, and why it inspires them, and if they've seen or felt a a kind of a gravitational pull in that direction in other parts of their life. And if they say yes, I say, well, why don't you think of a theme that represents you? So that when you're talking to people in the future and they say, well, what are you all about? You don't have to say, well, this is my role today, and I want to be this role tomorrow. You say, I'm committed to figuring out how to fill the gap between imagination and results. And I'm building my training and my discipline and my leadership skills around that. Well, if you're thinking about future opportunities and you say that simply to people, it catches their ear and it makes them think about, oh, wow, well, have you thought about this or this or this or this? And what you find out is, by working on a theme that represents your brand, you create more amazing choices to pursue. And you don't ever feel as constrained as you might by saying, oh, I got on this track and I'm stuck in this track forever. Well, you're not. The way you behave and the way you interact with people there's a brand and a theme to it. And if you can pull that out, you can see where you might be able to play and be productive in a lot of other ways. And it's fun to know you have those choices.
I think that's really neat because it means you're also not limiting yourself. You're not pigeonholing, right? The same way that maybe there's a brand of I don't know, a particular beverage or something, and maybe it's not just limited to being served in restaurants. Maybe you could buy it at the store. Maybe you could buy it at the train station. Maybe it's provided at holiday parties or whatever. And so if your personal theme or your brand is helping people, Sure, maybe at a bank you want to work in the call center or you want to be a teller, but maybe helping people could also mean working in a restaurant. Maybe helping people could mean working as a flight attendant. And so your theme transcends lines of business. Am I hearing that sort of
That's
correctly?
that's exactly right. I wanted to make sure that for somebody again that grew up not exactly knowing, like my brother, that I want to be surgeon. I I was nervous that I'd get stuck on a
You had to
path
go searching.
by accident, and I never wanted to get stuck on a path by accident. I wanted to see if there wasn't something about me that would always give me multiple paths, but would be appealing to others in the way I went about doing my work. And I think it's liberating for people sometimes when they're feeling burned out to realize that it's not the job they're doing today or the company they're working for or the industry they're in. It's the way they approach their job
Right.
that people admire and look at. And sometimes it's easy if you can describe that, it's easy to help others realize how you might fit in their world.
And that maybe that job that they're stuck in or they're burned out on is not their only option.
Right. And the important part of that is if you go to somebody and say, "Hey, how do you think I might be able to fit in your company?" Most people aren't going to get to know you well enough to say, "Oh, I think you'd be perfect here or here or here." They might say, "Tell me a little bit more about what you think you're good at." And if you have a tagline that you truly are inspired by and believe in, that gets the other person thinking about how there may be a fit where you never thought one would exist.
So fast forward from that, we're going to go to challenges part two now. Um, you you teased at the beginning that you're not a professional leadership advisor. I would beg to differ. I think you're certainly professional. I know you in a professional environment, and that's exactly what you helped me with. So I'm going to call you a professional leadership advisor. I think that's fair. But in that framework, in that role, surely you also run into challenges there sometimes, and perhaps especially with people in companies that you engage with who are more senior, but perhaps, to hone in on the term, not yet the best leaders. And so I'm curious to hear if you've had situations where you've been advisor to someone who was resistant to change or unwilling to listen to your suggestions because, well, they're the big boss. They know everything already, right? Almost like you're talking to someone who doesn't want to hear from you what your advice is, and then what happens? Do they ultimately come around? Is there an aha moment? Do you just kind of say, well, that person's beyond help. I can't work with them anymore. What do you do?
That's a great question, and thanks for asking it. I think I've also developed over time a little bit of a change management philosophy.
Okay.
Because a lot of a lot of getting things done involves leading change, and in general, I've always believed that about 20% of anybody you explain a new idea to actually get it faster and better than you could even describe what to do, and they're off and running. It just took describing it. And then another 20% actually hear it and get it, but they don't like the answer. And there's not very much you can do uh, after a fair amount of trying to maybe change their minds. They're just closed-minded about some of the ideas.
What don't they like about it? They see it as an insult to their personality, or just they would have to work extra and that's not appealing, or what is it that you think keeps them from taking that step to making a positive move?
In some cases, the source, somehow we just don't know each other enough for me to be a credible source for them to really think about a change.
Okay.
They need a credible somebody that they view or some reading that they do that's influential and inspiring and credible. In some cases, it's just philosophically difficult for them to imagine that they kind of need to move in a whatever direction of change. They just don't believe um, the assertion I'm making, and and in some cases, you're right. I would say they're just so busy and overwhelmed that uh, they see it and they're just going to need to figure out how to feather it into their environment over time, but it's not the right time. So the timing might be bad. And then, but the middle 60%, I want to go back to are ones that actually are more in that last category where they kind of see it and they feel it, but they just don't quite know how to enable it. So, hey, I see this change and I see what you're talking about, but let's talk about practical ways to actually start to move in that direction. And so,
You take an overwhelming suggestion and break it down into little steps so you
yeah,
can kind of get rolling type of thing.
yeah, and I think what I've learned to number one, it's easier. I've always enjoyed the idea of being a coach. I think early on, as that team instigator, I was trying to coach and cajole and do things like that, and had more formal training later on. I've always wanted to pay forward um, my learning to others to kind of help them move a little faster. And when I was in roles of authority, I found that it was a little easier sometimes to make suggestions and have people more willing to try.
Fair enough.
When you're an advisor and you really don't have any authority other than perhaps a little bit of credibility and your willingness to listen and help them diagnose, you really have to learn how to be patient and how to probe and how to be persuasive to see if you can move people in the right direction. And I think what I've discovered is sometimes you can see it and you want it for them, but there's going to be just a more gradual pace to accomplishing it, and that's just fine, honestly. If you incrementally build on improvement, it's surprising how much you can get done. And I had to learn how to be a little bit more patient. Ultimately, I also had to learn that if even though, like young managers, if I wanted to save everybody, I wanted to save everybody, and I'd work hard to try and see if there's not a way I could have them see the light. But after you've tried multiple times, if it's just not going to work, you just have to accept the idea that this is the wrong chemistry or the wrong time,
Right.
and there's a better source. And I'm I think I try to be vigilant on making sure that any discussion I have with anybody is a value added discussion. And if I sense that it's not, I try to be direct with them and say, this doesn't feel like it was a good use of time for you.
No, it's interesting that you mentioned sort of the position of authority too, because when I think back to our conversations, and obviously, there are folks in positions of authority within the bank that give me direction and give me guidance and do this and don't do that. And that's entirely normal and expected, but they've known me for so long
Yes.
in the role for so long, and what I'm good at, what I'm not good at for so long. And what I thought was really refreshing about our time was that you were exactly that. You weren't in a position of authority over me. You were an independent, outside person who had to get to know me first.
Hmm.
And you got to get to know me through conversations with myself and with my peers and with my managers and so forth. And that gave you a perspective that I actually found to be very valuable because it wasn't sort of, well, I've seen him do this for 15 years. We all know that, blah, blah, blah. But I've known you for a couple of weeks. Here's what I'm seeing. Here's what I'm hearing. Here's what I'm observing. Take it or leave it. And you were very, obviously, you were very polite and everything about the conversations that we had. And I thought that that was so refreshing that it was exactly that. It was an advisory type of relationship. Um, and that anyway, I wanted to just say that because it was I thought that was really neat.
Well,
But I did want to go back. Oh, go ahead.
yeah, no, I appreciate that. And honestly, I, I think you bring up a good point. People that you've known for a long time that are in positions of authority, um, you take their advice because you respect what they've accomplished sometimes. Sometimes they know you so well, and those are influential times as well. But yeah, you're right. I discovered that I play a different role, and I just have to sense the. I'm always careful but honest.
Right. I think
So,
that's a good approach.
and I feel like sometimes people aren't going to get honesty from everyone. And if I feel like I have a qualified observation that I've seen in other people or in my own life, and I can qualify it and give an example and then make a suggestion, even if it's stings a little,
Yep.
then I've done a good job of making somebody think a little bit more.
And there's a certain liberty in if I don't like your advice because it's too honest, or you don't like how I respond to it because, or whatever, um, we don't ever have to see each other again. And there's a
Right.
certain liberty in that that actually allows you to step back and say, well, wait a minute, this guy's onto something. He doesn't even know me, and he's onto something. So again, um, but you mentioned coaching before, and then you mentioned sort of the 60, not 60, the 20% of people who are too busy, life gets in the way, this, that. And I was wondering, um, do you do any coaching outside of your professional life? Do you also, quote, coach or any teams or any sports or anything like that? Sort of what passions do you have outside of work? And where I want to go with this is really to kind of understand how you balance work life. And
Yeah.
we can't always be working all the time. And we hear these stories, and athletes are a great example. They say, well, it's not it doesn't feel like a job. I love what I do, and I'm playing the game that I love. Well, yeah, you're playing the game that you love for a few hours on TV, but other than that, you're being meticulously managed, your nutrition, your workouts, your travel, you're never home. So there is a lot of work that goes into living the job that's the game that you love, right? And so I'm always curious to see how much of your work is your personality and you do the same things when you're not on the clock. You're coaching a little league team or something like that, versus it's your job and it's what you were good at professionally and you do completely different stuff on your private time.
Hmm.
Which one is the healthy way to go? What's the better work-life balance for a senior leader who's stressed out in a busy company?
Yeah, I'm not sure I was juggling early on. I was conscious of other activities, and so I like to try and exercise. I always have. I liked friends, and later when I had a family, paying attention to being a responsible, contributing member of the family was an important thing. A lot of my hobbies, I actually would tell you, I probably in the early days put on the shelf for my interest in trying to learn as much as I could and satisfy my ambition at work. I ultimately started to apply what we talked about at the outset of this podcast, which was, I really started to visualize not just a business outcome, but I started to visualize kind of an overall outcome for me. So, at some point out, 3 years or 5 years, and I tried to actually say, okay, how am I going to take all these competing things that I'm interested in, and ideally, how would I want it to work out in the future? And I started. It forced me to actually uh, reverse engineer priorities a little bit better.
Interesting.
So in the in the early days, I was consciously making the choice that I enjoyed what I was doing and that I would continue to try and learn and observe to make myself qualified for other things. And so in my case, my work and my work environment was kind of combined. You know, it was a passion to keep learning so I could satisfy my ambition, but I also made sure that I spent enough time with my family, which meant crazy hours for me sometimes. You know, making sure I knew when my family was around and making sure I wasn't working then, and then working different hours when they were asleep or whatever, and then staying in shape. I did coach because I loved it. You know, when the kids were growing up, I made sure I was a assistant coach on a soccer team. I had an amazing, fun couple of years coaching little league football, even before my kids were old enough for it, because an IBM manager told me that I would learn how to manage and lead more effectively in IBM by trying to figure out how to manage and lead seventh and eighth grade footballers. And that was a very, very fun experience. Today, I do much the same thing. I love the idea that I can stay connected um, to be business relevant and not have my stale date expire uh, with a limited amount of business involvement. And I balance it with what I visualized as something that was going to be important for me that I hadn't really focused on, which were other hobbies. So I semi-retired. I live in an area that's close to a resort, ski mountain, and so I've kind of taught myself how to be more competent in skiing and spent a lot of time doing that. And it's important. Um, Family is still really important, and actually, I have um, a desire to be more involved in some community related and larger societal issue related projects that are of interest to me, and I'm dedicating time to that because it's now time to balance some of those other interests in a different way. But people talk about work-life balance, and I think it's a very individual decision. And generally, when I talk to people that are asking about that, especially maybe younger people who have heard the word work-life balance and presume it means a certain thing, I try to say, no, it's what it means to you, and think ahead a little bit and ask yourself how you want your world to look across not just work, but a variety of areas in 2 or 3 years, and see what that means for the priorities you're setting today.
I think that's really, really neat. I haven't really heard it put that way. I was expecting you to suggest that work-life balance means different things for different people. Um, and yet I was not expecting you to say, to sort of to oversimplify it, to look in your personal crystal ball, imagine where you want yourself to be at X point in the future and what that would look like, and then reverse engineer, to use your words, sort of the plan to get there. I think that is really neat. Um, I want to touch on one more thing, and I do want to be cognizant of time as well. Um, you had mentioned a very impactful line when we were kind of talking about getting together and doing this. And I believe the words you used were, leadership is a process that creates followers. Now, linguistically, that might be obvious to most, because if you are a leader, there must be followers behind you, and that's sort of how it works, right? But these days, everybody talks about followers. You got followers on Twitter and YouTube and whatever else the latest, hippest social media is. And that's definitely not what you mean, right? I mean, let's dig into that a little bit. What is it that you mean leadership is a process to create followers? And what would be an example where, maybe this kind of created followership then resulted in positive change for an individual or for their organization?
Yeah, well, thanks. I'll tell you first. It's a mindset. It's a mindset. It's my mindset that's handy for me, and I'll try to explain it because I'd love others to have this mindset. Um, Back in the IBM days, I was managing fairly large business in a very bad economy. And there was a lot not going well. And people weren't very happy either. So, we got together, our little management team, one night after work and had a meeting. And remember, we're kind of technology oriented people. And in technology, there's this idea of you have inputs, then you process them, and then there's outputs.
Absolutely.
And factories can do that and everything else. So if you have inputs and you process them, you want to have a high yield of, of a result. And so somebody drew that on the board and they said, well, is leadership an art, or do we think there's a method to it? And we all agreed that we hoped there was a method to it, because if it was an art, we didn't know if we were naturals or not.
Right.
So I asked everybody to take a poll, an anonymous poll, little pieces of paper in a hat, and I asked them to say if leadership here is a methodology, the process, and the input is all the folks that are working for us, what do we think the yield of followership is for our people? And nobody in the room wrote more than 30%.
Wow.
And so that was pretty self-aware, maybe self-critical, because we were in the mood to be self-critical. But what was interesting about that is we all looked at each other and said, that's not good. And, are we going to do something about it? And what we did was, if you, again, picture a lot of people, part of a company, our leadership applied to them to get them all going in one direction happily and smoothly. And then our estimate that the yield was 30%. Well, that meant that in that little box called leadership, there were a lot of leaks.
Yep. You lost 70% of the people along the way.
So the fun exercise that one of our colleagues led us through was, okay, if we're leaking followers, what is it that we're actually doing that's causing that to happen? And we got talking about it and we said, well, you know what? I'm not sure we've properly communicated to everybody what we're aiming for. And they all said, oh, come on, we've all written our mission statement and we have our goals out there for the year. And somebody said, no, wait a minute. People don't just hear things once and immediately get it. There's a lot of things going on in everybody's lives. Are we regularly and in an inspiring way explaining what the outcome that we desire might look like in the future? A little bit on my, have an inspiring outcome. Then we said, well, have we actually adjusted the way we measure and ask people to perform so that it would line up with that outcome? Or have we made the changes we need to make to reinforce what the behavior looks like? And that was another area where we thought it was leaking. A really interesting one was, do we believe we're behaving in a way ourselves when issues come to us that reinforce that new world? Or are we acting with our old instincts? And we kind of called ourselves out to say, well, we're 50-50 on that, and so on and so forth. And so we made a list of about 7 or 8 things that we thought would close the leaks. And we wrote down what that meant that we had to go get done. We had some, again, a vision of where we were aiming, which was a higher yield. We talked about the benefits of that and the obstacles, and then we made a more practical plan to hold ourselves accountable to making those changes. And by the end of the year, a very difficult business environment had improved a lot. And a lot of the people that were struggling with our environment changing, the technology world was changing around us. We kind of got through that through the right effort in the right spots. And so I I adopted this idea that if I had a group of people, whether it was, in my personal life or, in some other non-business related activity, and we wanted to accomplish something, I had to always be very conscious of who those people were. And if I wasn't getting them all aligned to create this outcome, it was my responsibility to figure out where the leaks were and to try and be helpful in plugging those leaks.
It's fascinating. We think of leadership as a skill and not something easily quantifiable. And you created a way to measure a quantifiable result of leadership in that 30% and growing, who's going to be the followership. So you can actually see what's working and what's not working, and then go and apply that to improve the non-quantifiable skill.
Well, and it was to your point, it was in some instances very quantifiable, and in some instances, I called it objectively subjective.
I've
Which
heard
really
that used before.
which just kind of meant, the important part of the mindset, Greg, for me, was to truly not be so arrogant as to presume that just because I was the leader, everybody was following. I stopped and really tried to be honest and sample what the important followership really was. And when I heard it wasn't where I thought it was going to be, I didn't blame everybody else. It made me want to know, where are the leaks? And it led to some really fun, practical, creative things. We actually, even once during that year I explained to you of the story, we decided that little tiny things were aggravating people and we weren't dealing with them fast enough because it was such a crazy environment. So we took a little part of our call center and we had a lot of people, over a couple thousand. We told them that they could call what we called 1-800 I can't get my job done. And we just let them call the call center and tell us what they thought was aggravating them. And we logged those and categorized them and looked at them every week and took action on them where we could, but followed up with everybody for no other reason than to prove to people that we were paying attention and listening.
Well, for what it's worth, and I hope I'm using the term correctly, I'm a follower. Marty, it's been an absolute pleasure. It was a pleasure working with you the first time around. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you today. I know we want to be cognizant of time here and anything. Any kind of closing thoughts? Any particular sort of last sentiments that you may want to share, or a leader in your life or history that's made a particular impact on you, or something kind of you want to dangle out there as the last word in our chat?
Wow, that's dangerous for me. But
well,
I'll
we
try
have
not
an
to.
editing team, so you can say whatever
Oh.
you'd like.
Well, yeah, I guess a couple of concepts that I always try to leave people with that I think are really important, and you hear them reinforced and maybe validated when you listen to other podcasts like the Founders, which reviews a lot of philosophies of various leaders, and again, as inspiring as athlete stories are, for their grit and relentlessness and everything else, this is a similar version of that for very successful business leaders.
Absolutely, I'm familiar with the podcast.
Yeah, a couple things that I take away that I've heard other places is I think I really learned over time to never feel entitled to my stature, or never feeling entitled to the success we're having, to always feel like you're earning it every day, and to fight arrogance or hubris. in order to listen. That's where the searching for leaks comes in. Second, I always used to tell anybody that worked for me, and I would try to sell it to people I worked for, that every performance review or every performance objective document should start as the number one line item saying no surprises both ways. And that I find that if people commit to doing their best to not creating any surprises, it causes a lot more communication, and it gives people the permission to have conversations sometimes they'd be afraid to have. And I'll stop with those two because I think that kind of mindset makes you work hard to stay aligned with your teammates and makes you collaborative, and always keeps you on your toes to make sure you're earning value for your customers and for your team members.
Fantastic, Marty. A little humility and a little integrity to close things out for us. I love it. Thank you again so much for joining today. I had a great time. I could talk to you for hours about this stuff, so you may have to pick it up another time.
Well, I really appreciate being included. Thanks very much.
For more information on today's subject, visit leaderbank.com. In addition to past episodes, you can also find our corresponding blog entries for more insights. This podcast is a production of Leader Bank NA, Equal Housing Lender, member FDIC, NMLS number 449250.